Hi, my name's Professor Kylie O'Brien, and I'm delighted to be part of your conference, even though I can't be there in person. Today I'm talking about menopause and medicinal cannabis. These are my declarations. So let's look at briefly the common symptoms associated with menopause. I've listed them there on the left. You are, I'm sure, well and truly familiar with them. We do know that women over 60 years of age, hormone replacement therapy is associated with increased risk of several serious conditions. And so I guess there are fewer options for symptom management and chronic disease prevention. So perhaps medicinal cannabis might have a role to play. Now, we know that women are actually using medicinal cannabis for menopause-related symptoms from surveys. This was a cross-sectional survey of Canadian women. Around 500 were current users. More than 75% were using cannabis for medical purposes, and the most common reasons were sleep, anxiety, and muscle or joint achiness. Another survey, this time in the US, was a survey of women who are interested in women's health and cannabis, recruited via social media. So there's some bias in the study population already. However, there were around 131 perimenopausal and 127 postmenopausal respondents. 86% were current cannabis users. 79% endorsed medicinal cannabis use for menopause-related symptoms. The top reasons were sleep disturbance and mood and anxiety. This study was a study of midlife women veterans, and 27% had used or used cannabis for symptom management. It's in comparison to 19% who used more traditional therapies like hormone replacement therapy. Now, medicinal cannabis use was more frequently reported in the last 2 weeks in women reporting hot flashes and night sweats. So that was statistically significant compared to non-users. So what is cannabis? Well, cannabis sativa has been around in many, many cultures for centuries. It's got over 540 different constituents. The main ones you're going to hear about are the main phytocannabinoids, cannabidiol and tetrahydrocannabinol, but there are actually more than 120 phytocannabinoids. There are also more than 200 terpenes that have been isolated from cannabis. They give they're essential oil-like substances that give the plant its characteristic smell, and they've got their own therapeutic actions as well. And then you've got many other plant nutrients. So it's the combination of these minor phytocannabinoids and terpenes and other plant nutrients which are likely to enhance the therapeutic action of cannabidiol and tetrahydrocannabinol. And that's what they mean by the entourage effect. Now, importantly, cannabis is not one thing. There's hundreds of cultivated varieties, and each has got its own phytochemical profile. So that means the types of phytocannabinoids and terpenes in there, the relative amount or proportion, and that has an impact on the therapeutic action. And of course, there's many different types of medicinal cannabis products on the market too. So why might cannabis be useful to address ill health? Well, the plant and its key constituents, and I'm only really going to talk about CBD and THC today, have got many therapeutic properties. And importantly, the components of cannabis interact with our endocannabinoid system. Now, if you had your first tertiary education experience prior to the 1990s, like I did, you would not have learned about the endocannabinoid system because it really wasn't discovered until the 1990s. The chemical structure of THC was isolated around 1964. They went looking for the receptors for it, and when they found the receptors, they also found that we make our own cannabinoids. They're endocannabinoids. So the endocannabinoid system is a complex neuro and immunoregulatory system with a role in regulating most bodily functions, really: pain and analgesia, sleep, mood and emotions and memory, cognition, body temperature, energy homeostasis, bone metabolism, vascular tone, neurotransmitters, neuroprotection, and so on. The components are endocannabinoids. The main ones you'll hear about are anandamide and 2-arachidonylglycerol, or 2AG, but there are many others. The main cannabinoids are CB1 and CB2 receptors, but there are others too. There are membrane transporters, and there then are the enzymes that synthesize and break down the endocannabinoids once they've done their jobs. Now, cannabinoid receptors can be found in most parts of the body, but CB1 receptors are highly concentrated in the central nervous system, whereas CB2 receptors are highly concentrated in the cells, tissues, and organs of the immune system. So, cannabinoid receptors have also been found in the reproductive organs of both males and females, and they are expressed in the hypothalamus and pituitary glands. So, activation of these cannabinoid receptors modulates all endocrine hypothalamic peripheral endocrine axes. Now, endocannabinoids are manufactured on demand from membrane lipid precursors, but there's also an intracellular store of them as well. You can see from this diagram that anandamide can trigger many different signaling pathways via different receptors, not only the CB1 and CB2 receptors where it's a partial agonist, but also TRPV1, the G protein receptors 55 and 119, and within the nucleus of the cell, the PPARs, and even at the level of the mitochondria. 2-AG, in contrast, is a full agonist at the cannabinoid receptors. In the nervous system, the endocannabinoid system acts as a retrograde signaling system to decrease the release and transmission of other neurotransmitters. And the downstream effect of that depends on where in the brain or body you're talking about and what neurotransmitters are involved. You've got CB1 and CB2 receptors also on other cell types, for example, enteroendocrine cells, immune cells, intestinal epithelium cells, and they will modulate or mediate endocannabinoid actions in several different ways. For example, on enteroendocrine cells, they can inhibit the release of enteroendocrine hormones. In intestinal epithelial cells, those cannabinoid receptors can regulate tight junctions. Now, the endocannabinoid system is involved in the female reproductive organs, so in the endometrium, in the ovary and the oviduct, the endocannabinoids regulate a number of different functions. You can see that picture on the right-hand side. The endocannabinoid system, both centrally and locally, affects the activity of the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. That's in both men and women. Now, animal research suggests that estrogens directly modulate the endocannabinoid system in the central nervous system. Now, several disorders in postmenopausal women, including obesity and osteoporosis, as well as cardiovascular disease and cancer, can be associated with decreased estrogen. Now, research shows that this crosstalk between the endocannabinoid system and sex hormones, so a change in estrogen and progesterone production in postmenopausal women, is strongly related to changes in the endocannabinoid system activity. Now, there's a possible link between dysregulation of the endocannabinoid system, estrogen deficiency, and development of pathological changes related to menopause. So if there's a compromised hormone condition, this may induce changes in the endocannabinoid levels and the cannabinoid receptor expression, leading to reduced efficacy of receptor signaling, and this may then be related to increased oxidative stress, triggering of inflammation, reduced bone density, and increased cardiovascular risk and cancer progression. The research also shows a protective role of the endocannabinoid system can counteract the harmful effects of these menopause-related diseases. So the relevance here is that the endocannabinoid system may be an important therapeutic target to decrease the risk of pathologies as well as treat symptoms associated with menopause. So, how might cannabis be useful for menopausal symptoms? So if we look at the actions of THC, it interacts with the endocannabinoid system. It mimics anandamide, being a partial agonist at the cannabinoid receptors. It's analgesic, it's anti-inflammatory, muscle relaxant, and a number of different actions there on the right-hand side. Cannabidiol is non-euphoric, it's non-addictive, it's got a different mechanism of action, it's got really low affinity for the cannabinoid receptors, so they think it acts mostly via other receptors. Again, on the right-hand side, you can see it's got a number of useful therapeutic actions: analgesia, anxiolytic, antidepressant, antipsychotic, antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, and so on. So what evidence is there that medicinal cannabis might be able to treat menopause-related symptoms? Now, before we jump into the scientific research, just be aware that there's a long history of use of cannabis in gynecology, dating back to ancient Mesopotamia, the Egyptian pharmacopoeia since the times of the pharaohs, Indian folk medicine, China, Persia. In more recent time in the UK, Sir John Russell Reynolds, the personal physician to Queen Victoria, used it to treat her menstrual cramps. And one of the legends of gynecology in the US, Farlow, also recommended the use of suppositories for the treatment of menopause-associated symptoms. So, could CBD, for example, be useful in treating conditions associated with postmenopause? Well, certainly it's got a number of diverse pharmacological activities that are relevant. Research shows it's antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, protects from collagen-induced arthritis, it reduces bone loss and improves the gut barrier. So a number of different references there. In one preclinical study of overactimized mice and sham surgery mice, so the treatment was either with CBD or vehicle. Compared to vehicle or placebo-treated overactimized mice, the CBD-treated overactimized mice had better oral glucose tolerance, increased energy expenditure, improved bone mineral density and mineral content, and increased relative abundance of fecal lactobacillus species, as well as several gene expression changes in the intestine in the femur, which were consistent with reduced inflammation and less bone resorption. So some promising preclinical evidence. Now, if we look at what evidence is there in the literature, really there's a lack of studies across the board in menopausal women. So we have to look at the other literature in other populations to have a look at whether it might apply in menopause. So certainly in chronic pain, there's substantial evidence of efficacy of medicinal cannabis in several systematic reviews. In anxiety, there's a moderate amount of evidence that CBD can reduce anxiety. A number of randomized clinical trials demonstrate that. In sleep, in CBD, there's some animal and human studies that show CBD is sedating, and others show that it's alerting. So that might be related to the dose as well as the experimental conditions. Results of systematic reviews are kind of mixed. Some evidence sleep improvements, but others show that there's alteration to sleep architecture, and many of the randomized controls included have got shortcomings. And for those who are interested, there's a little bit more detail around sleep. Now, in terms of systematic reviews, there was one systematic review of menopause treatment of cannabis. It was published 2021. Only 3 studies met their inclusion criteria, and really they don't give us much to hang our hats on here. One study had 10 postmenopausal women. They looked at the effects of smoking, 1.8% THC versus placebo cannabis. They didn't find any significant changes in self-rated scores of depression or fatigue in either group, and there were no increases in elation or positive mood scores associated with cannabis either. Second study was 120 HIV-infected women. They found that menopausal status and cannabis use is crudely associated with hot flashes, but you don't know what way that association goes, and it's not causal anyway. The last one was an online survey which evaluated the expectancies of menopausal patients who endorsed lifetime use. So they found that the women surveyed expected cannabis to treat symptoms of irritability, depression, anxiety, and sleep problems significantly more than others. And joint muscle discomfort was the highest rated expectancy. And none, of course, assessed quality of life. So really not much there to go on. So where are we now? Well, we know women are using medicinal cannabis for menopause symptoms. We think that it might be useful in menopause-related pain and anxiety and sleep disturbance, perhaps depression, because we can draw from evidence from other populations. But there's no studies that I could find on vasomotor symptoms or genitourinary syndrome or cognitive function or quality of life or osteoporosis, despite there being some promising preclinical evidence on that one. So there's a massive lack of human studies of medicinal cannabis treatment of menopause-associated symptoms. And therefore, if we don't have a lot of scientific evidence, it makes it difficult for practitioners to be able to give advice to patients. So real-world data is needed. And part of what we're doing at Canham is we're involved in a rather ambitious project called the Lemire Mission, which aims to help over 1 million people in 4 years. Part of the Lemire Mission has a focus on women's health research, including menopause symptoms, particularly sleep and anxiety. And as part of that research, we want to engage with leading professional bodies in menopause to help find solutions and ensure that we're looking at patient-centred outcomes. So I hope that has been useful, that you've learned a little bit about medicinal cannabis in a very short time frame. If you'd like to reach out and contact me, here's my email. I'll be delighted to hear from you. So thanks again for including me in your conference.